Thanks. Last count, Corla. I've heard the Minister for Finance speak about the Future Ireland Fund and say that he hopes it will have accumulated up to €100 billion in assets by 2035. Obviously, we often talk about big numbers in this place, and they can lose a sense of meaning of just how much money €100 billion is. But it is a phenomenal amount of money. It is an amount of money that could make a real difference to people's lives being invested when we have it. I mean, all of this is predicated on the idea that there may be a rainy day someday in the future and we have to be prepared and so on. And it just misses the reality that it is pouring now for people in terms of the ongoing crises in housing, in health, in education, in climate action, in biodiversity. Crises that €100 billion could go a very, very long way towards resolving. We could set up a state construction company. We could directly build hundreds of thousands of social and genuinely affordable homes. Forget about all this messing around with the Help to Buy scheme, with incentivising landlords, with incentivising developers. Directly, a state construction company to build homes. We could guarantee a home for everyone who is on the housing list. We could actually get every single adult out of their parents' box room and into a home of their own. Despite what the Taoiseach said, we don't need to move mountains to do that. The state simply needs to spend money that it already has on directly building universal public housing. On top of that, we could retrofit every home that needs it, reducing energy usage significantly, saving people a lot of money on their bills. We could end the use of prefabs in our schools. We could build every new school building and classroom that is needed. We could fund new metro systems, Lewis lines in every city, and invest in a real all-island rail network. We could build state-owned on- and offshore wind farms to help us convert to 100% renewable electricity. But instead of doing any of that, the government is proposing to salt away the €100 billion in unspecified investments, subject only to maximising financial return until 2041. It should be clear to people that there is no requirement for any of this money to be invested here in this country. So there can be zero return to the economy, to people in this country between now and 2041, when the government is to be allowed to start spending money from the Future Ireland Fund. The NTMA is set to manage the €100 billion fund in much the same way as NAMA managed its billions of euros in assets, not for any socially useful purpose, but for maximising financial return. It was in the name, if you remember, it was in the name of maximising financial return that NAMA sold off thousands of apartments and vast tracts of development land to vulture funds, built loads of useless office blocks and sowed the seeds of the current housing and homelessness crisis. The way this bill is drafted perpetuates that same neoliberal mindset, narrow mindset of maximising financial return over all other considerations. Like the Act that set up NAMA, it gestures towards wider social considerations, but then subordinates all of that to maximising financial return. Section 6.2 of the bill states that the NTMA, in its management of the Future Ireland Fund, is to quote, have regard to, quote, environmental, social and governance, end quote, risks, only to the extent that they are, quote, relevant, end quote, to securing optimal total financial return. In other words, unless environmental, social and governance considerations also affect the bottom line, they actually do not matter. Even then, when the magic year of 2041 rolls around and the state is finally to be allowed to spend this money, there is nothing in this bill to specify what the Future Ireland Fund is to be spent on. No mention of capital investments, no mention of pensions, even though that is how the Minister is trying to sell this fund in the media. All it says is that the money can be drawn down by the Exchequer. No guidance on how it will be spent, no guidance on how it is not to be spent. No guidance, no legislation, nothing saying it won't be used simply to bail out the banks, to bail out the bondholders again. The same is true for the vast majority of the second fund set up by this bill. The Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund is to amount to 14 billion, but only a maximum of 3.15 billion of it can be spent on environmental projects. The other 9 billion can only be drawn down if there is a significant economic or fiscal deterioration for the state, in which case the 3.15 billion for environmental projects can also be diverted away from those environmental projects. There is actually, despite the name, no guarantee in this bill that any money of it will actually be spent on environmental projects. The only guarantee in the bill is that the limited environmental dimension of the fund will end in 2030. Does the government think that the climate and biodiversity crisis will be over by 2030? Is the plan to simply throw in the towel when we reach to 2030? Eamon Ryan just the other day was telling us how we're only getting warmed up, and unfortunately that is very tragically true. The Minister for Finance is selling the same line about the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund as he is about the Future Ireland Fund. That it will provide funds for counter-cyclical capital investment if there is a downturn. But in reality, there is nothing in the bill that even hints at the other €9 billion being used for capital investment. All it says, again, is that the money can be withdrawn if there is a significant economic or fiscal deterioration. We all know what happened last time Fianna Fáil and the Greens had billions of euros in state funds when there was a downturn. They had a national pension reserve fund worth €21 billion in 2007. That was, they said, was for future old age pensions, and they promised would not be touched until 2025. But when the property bubble burst in 2008, they used it to bail out the banks. And there is nothing in this bill to stop the same thing happening with the 100 billion, as I mentioned earlier, in the Future Ireland Fund, or also the 14 billion in the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. We are currently in the middle of a commercial property crash, with investors handing back the keys to office developments. Are we going to see the Minister back in here saying that the private pension funds that invested in these office blocks have to be bailed out? Or will we be told we need to compensate investors in stranded fossil fuel assets? Or that we need the money to pay massive multi-billion euro fines for our failure to meet our climate obligations? All of that is possible with this bill. And when you tell us, no, don't worry, that's not going to happen, people should not believe you. Just on an unrelated issue, we saw just Simon Harris becomes leader of Fine Gael, and then the signal is, don't worry about the sick pay legislation that we passed, because we're going to row back on that. We were told, I raised it at the time, why isn't it in the legislation? Why isn't it guaranteed? Why is it left up to a minister to decide? No, don't worry, of course we're going to do all these things. And now, because it's politically expedient, it seems you're going to bow to pressure from businesses and attempt to withdraw from that. The same applies to this bill. This can be a massive bailout fund. What isn't possible is that any of the planned €100 billion in the Future Ireland Fund can be directed towards anything socially or environmentally useful for the next 17 years. So I would say this to people: the next time that you are sitting waiting for hours in an overcrowded A&E department, when you're stuck in a traffic jam, unable to access decent public transport, when you're living in your parents' box room, remember that Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens have the money to change all of that, but they choose not to do it. They have the money to fix the health service, they have the money to end congestion by investing in free, frequent public transport, they have the money to guarantee everybody in this country a forever home of their own, but they choose not to do it. The people of Ireland have a choice too. We can kick Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens out at the next election. We can break the cycle of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, of boom and bust, of poverty amid plenty, of immense profits on the one hand for those at the top, and struggle for so many people in this country that encapsulates the nature of the capitalist system. We can build people power movements for housing for all, for healthcare for all, for education, for free public transport for all, and we can vote for a real left government that takes on the landlords, the bosses and the big polluters, that fights for eco-socialist change, that says we're going to use the money and the resources that we have to invest in our society, to address the crises in our society, as opposed to putting it away to bail out the rich at some later point down the line.